Had the opportunity to serve on a Howard County Pride Interfaith panel at Owen Brown Interfaith Center here in Columbia this past week. I introduce myself as such. I'm Reverend Claire Matheny. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I serve at Kidamakundi Community Church. And alongside me were other faith representatives here nearby, and it was such a blessing to sit on that panel of 8 and look out and see all the people who showed up to hear from us. Now, we know whenever we go into a session like this, we're thinking, okay, I'm here because of the role that I have, and I'm being called to come and share out of that community. And guess what? I went and wanted to be a good representative, not only of this larger thing called the Christian faith, but of you, my dear ones, of who I represented coming from Kidamakundi Community Church. We think attentively whenever we go into a setting as going into a sermon or preaching, wherever you're going and you're called to be a representative for something or someone, you think mindfully about what you say and what it is that you are specifically called to be in that space. For we all, in the large scheme of things, are called to be a specific people in a specific day of which we are called 2023 here in Columbia, Maryland. And we know that God has gifted us with the gifts that we uniquely, particularly have. And we sometimes wonder how we can share that on with others. So I felt a little bit of trepidation in going into that space because I so longed to convey the spirit of inclusion and hopefulness that we have here at KC for those who might not otherwise have ever been here and might be tempted through what is shared to come and to be curious and to find out what it is that we believe together. A people of deep questions, a people that doesn't have all the answers, but nonetheless, a people who look to this person, this Jesus and his stories, and somehow are inspired to put our love in action. When you speak on a panel, or let's say you go to apply for a job, you don't dust off an old resume and submit it, right? Hopefully not. You want to sound fresh, and you have to think about what it is that will potentially be conveyed, who is reading it, and the setting of the job itself. Has anyone applied for a job recently? I'm looking at some people I know who have very recently applied for a job. Nerve-wracking to say the least, all of the waiting that happens. There are things that you add or detract to a cover letter of introduction about your objectives, your beliefs, and your wish to highlight in order to suit this setting, right? You don't want to accidentally cite the wrong company that you are applying for on the cover letter, because then you might indicate that you don't really care about them or what their mission is. Paul is no different. The language sounds a bit funky on our ears. If I'm honest, I think if he was applying to be the enabling minister of KC, he would not get a call back. But that isn't his call. So he hasn't created his letter for specifically us in our setting today. He doesn't have in mind the complexity of what it means to be a 21st century church in Columbia, Maryland, but he has thought intently about the complexity of what it means to be a Christ follower in Rome. He is outlining why he is well suited to come and preach and teach at Rome and be well received. So he's not applying for a tenure track position. I don't think he would ever fit long enough and could stay seated and still long enough to be a tenured kind of guy. No, he's perhaps a visiting professorship on its way. He shares his intellectual prowess, but is always careful to say that it is the gospel that he is confident about, not his own worthiness. The Greek word for gospel is euangelion. The Latin is evangelium, meaning good news or good telling. The word gospel in English derives from the term Godspell, sound familiar, meaning good story. So what is so good about the story of Jesus, the telling of the good news? He uses it 3 times alone in the passage that we read today. This is perhaps an important topic in a time and place where the loaded word evangelical and its interpretation and application displays all kinds of fault lines in the Christian world. But more than landing on that word today, let's consider what the good story is. The good story is relevant for the people at Rome, and we can look at 3 key ways that Paul will outline them in this long book, this long story that he will be telling. Important and chief among them is God's faithfulness. Through the life of the Messiah, Jesus, we come to know the saving grace of God, faithful and just in fulfilling the promises of Scripture, the relying and the trust on God, God's faithfulness. Secondly, the creation of a new family. This is a family that has no geographic bounds and is not limited to those born into the Jewish community. This is an inclusive, redemptive story in which all are invited into a new way of being, both Jew and Gentile. Thirdly, the importance of unity. We are not meant to live as a broken and fractured people. Through the inclusive witness of Christ, we see the power of God at work, and we have fellowship together. Did you hear those last lines about mutual encouragement? That he's coming and he doesn't seek just to impart his will and his way and his theological, high-minded explanation about who Christ is, but he knows that it means rolling up his sleeves, listening to people, and truly understanding what is happening there among the people. And by that, they might find mutual encouragement, things that he offers them and that they offer him in return. As we know, so often he was in need of fiscal support along his way. We know that he had to use his hands to make his labor and way in the world. And he knows that if he goes in and experiences that xenia and hospitality of those whom he meets, that they can be mutually blessed through the unity of Christ Jesus. For I so long to see you that I may share with you some spiritual gift so that you may be strengthened, or rather so that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. God is faithful. God calls us to be a new family, and the importance of unity as we are all called into God's love. Now we ask about our story today, how it is that this letter that wasn't exactly intended to us, but by the Spirit and the divine blessing of its permanence with us, comes to us today and blesses us through this same lens. That we experience a God who is faithful to us wherever we are on the journey. And we see that trail of faithfulness in the gospel story, also in the Hebrew scriptures, but then have the benefit of all these hundreds of years, centuries in which we have seen faithful people tirelessly trying to live out their faith, and sometimes getting it very bloodily wrong. As we think about the Christian witness, we have to acknowledge that just as Jesus died in violence, that so often violence has been a part of our human story. Sometimes it is those like the early martyrs and beyond who are killed for their faith as they try to witness to Christ. And most unfortunately, it has also been those who claim the banner of Christ who have enacted so much ill and violence as well. This is the complicated story that unfolds of which we come to today. But somehow our good story and understanding of Jesus triumphs over this violence and this sin and death. How can it be? For many of us, we grew up as Christians, and so we are taught from an early age of Jesus letting the little children come to him. And that image over and over again helps us to feel worthy when we otherwise feel cast out, and helps us in our anger when we see all of the horrible and violent things that are happening in this world, some of them perpetuated by people that also claim a similar faith, or at least a similar tradition to what we might hold. What do we do with that? It doesn't sound so much like the good story. Towards the end of the panel, there was an opening up for questions and answers there. We were starting to get later into the evening, and there was a sense of wanting to know what was on the minds of the folks who were out there listening. One person raised their hand, and it was obvious that they had been affected by the ongoing reality that some of the laws of discrimination and some of the vitriol that has continued to be put out there in terms of the marginalization of LGBTQIA+ individuals has come from people, has come from churches even, calling themselves Christians and seeking to live out what they call a Christ-based or biblically based faith. And so it was a heavy heart that the person looked out and said, "Of you Christians on the panel," and we're all looking around like, "Ooh, that's me." What do you do with that? How do you counter that message? How do you be present to it, acknowledging this reality that there's so many things that don't feel like a good story out there? And then what is it when someone takes what you think is a good story and uses it not to include and create a larger family? but uses it to exclude and to have people feel like they don't want to turn to religion or wonder how could you think it's a good story? After all, when it comes down to it, the person of Jesus undergoes the reality of suffering and violence himself. How could we extol something that ended up with such a brutal killing? Except when we think about Paul's lens, the faithfulness of God that has continued to show up nonviolently, a counter to the violence over and over again if we think of the witness of Christ, nonviolently showed up into the deepest and rawest pain of our existence, and did so in such a way that there is a belief that God's people are all people. And those of us who can see that there are many paths by which people learn and grow in the spirit of who God calls us to be as humankind, and do believe beyond all odds, and sometimes with the difficulty of trying to explain it, try to put our faith and love, not only in our words, but in our actions. Now, I by no means had the best or most eloquent response to this question, but because it was clear that this person's pain was deep and real. But to be among the three of us who could respond coming from the Christian faith and acknowledge how deeply flawed this narrative is, wanting to show up into advocacy if any of us want to, but continuing to live out a witness that says that the Christian message is centered on the goodness of God and the goodness that we are called to live out each and every day. Now we know, friends, that you no doubt have found yourself in conversation with people who doubt or scratch their heads and have no idea why it is you would choose to be going to church. Certainly many of them are under the age of 40 today. And it might not make sense why you would want to gather in this place at all. But I go back to the mutual encouragement of Paul. I go back because I do deeply believe that we need each other. And despite all that is around this narrative of Christ, I think when we zero in and center in on that nonviolence and that love that triumphs even death and even that which was enacted upon him, that the story is still so deeply compelling to me. We're about to have an opportunity to go into breakouts. I don't know where you are on your journey this very morning, or what it means when you hear that this could be a good story. So my encouragement to you is, perhaps as you're thinking about what it means to share on something good about this journey of which you take part, what is it that would resonate for you? What is so good about the story? And seemingly, what's important to share about the good story? This could be of Christ or of God as you've come to know God in your life. We're going to have an opportunity to break out, whether you're online or you're in a house, in groups of about 3 or 4, and have about 10 minutes together. Now, sometimes we're afraid of silence, but if your group is needing to sit with this and wrestle with this question, please feel free. Remember the opportunity to hear from each other and to introduce yourself to each other if you haven't yet met, and the chance to lean into what a good story sounds like to you. Is Paul's story, as we've set it up today, a good one? And what does that mean in terms of what's important to share today?